Actually, I graduated from Valley College. Yeah, so it's really good. It's really good to be home. You know, when I first graduated, well, when I first got my master's degree from USC, so I'm in a PhD program at USC, you're able to teach at a community college with a master's. And this is the first place I wanted to come back to. So I came here, and this is the first place I started teaching. Once, also, you could also teach part-time at Cal State, and I graduated from Cal State LA, so that was the second place that I went, you know, go Golden Eagles. You know, I know, sorry for those of you who go to Northridge and things like that, and want to go to Northridge. No offense to Northridge, but, you know, I have an affinity for those schools since they did so much for me. I've always believed in, you know, giving back to community and stuff, and being a part of a community, so I like teaching at a community college. In fact, I love teaching community college. It's the only thing I want to do. So actually, I had some PowerPoint slides. It's mostly just pictures, but the title of my talk was, "My name is James and I'm a feminist." And the reason why is that a lot of times people think that feminism is kind of a dirty word, you know, in the U.S. vocabulary. We treat it as if this is this big negative. And there's these stereotypes of these quote-unquote, as people would describe them as feminazis, as, you know, Rush Limbaugh, I think, is the idiot, the person who sits there and calls them that. And then there's people who sit there and might talk about these angry, quote-unquote, feminist, man-hating lesbians, as they call them too. And I would sit there and say, if you're a woman and a feminist, I don't think there's anything wrong with you being angry, okay? I also don't think that there's anything wrong for hating men who don't recognize their privilege and then take advantage of you. And also, there's absolutely nothing wrong with people who are lesbian. So, those things are things that I think we need to think about on why we hate feminism. And I gave my students today, because I was talking about coming here and having the privilege of giving this talk, I give the students the example of what I think a feminist is. And before, I used to ask my students, and I can ask you in this room, how many of you believe that women should have equal rights? Raise your hand. All right. And probably nobody in this room who doesn't believe it wouldn't raise their hand. But at the same time, I used to say that that was enough to call yourself a feminist, but I've changed that. I think in order to be a feminist, you have to believe in women's rights, but you have to be doing something to move towards those rights. Your personal life and your personal experiences, and question your personal experiences, your own personal privilege as a man, those type of things as well. Or it could be, you know, going on and actually working in organizations and those type of things and talking to other people, including your friends. I also want to acknowledge something else. I told my students this today, that I'm really privileged that I was asked to sit there and talk at this, you know, to the Feminist Club and on this day and so on, because, in particular, because it is a women's group and it is feminism and so on, to be invited as an outsider to that group really is a lot of privilege. But at the same time, I also recognize the fact that being a man talking about these issues does give me more privilege than my female counterparts. Many of my female counterparts say the exact same thing I do, and they get dismissed right away. Right? I go through the same issues when I talk about race. You know, as an African-American male, people dismiss me saying, of course you believe there's racism, you're black, okay? Well, for women, a lot of times, oh, of course you believe there's sexism, you're a woman, all right? And my argument to that is that people make this assumption that because you are a member of the oppressive group as opposed to the oppressed group, you can be more objective. As if you don't have a stake in ending sexism and so on, or racism and so on. That's when the only way you can sit there and be objective. But us men, we have a stake in maintaining sexism, you know? So thus, we also cannot be objective when discussing it, because it goes against what we would sit there and consider in our best interest. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. Also, I just want to talk about feminism, you know, and its effect on academia, because in my work, I do what's called intersectionality, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But in my opinion, feminist researchers have probably done more to advance sociology than probably any other researcher that's come along, all right, in a lot of different ways. Feminist researchers, just in talking about criminology, are the ones who start bringing up the issues of masculinity and how important it is to sit there and talk about masculinity and its relationship to crime. Now, for people in this room, maybe you might think, well, of course. But when I first started in sociology over at USC, I got invited to this very prestigious program in San Diego, where, you know, they invited a bunch of people. Well, you had to apply to it and everything else. People from all over the country, including Harvard and Berkeley, USC, UCLA were invited to it. People from other countries as well were invited to or applied to it and so on. And at the end of 1 week, they paid for our room and board and everything, food, or the whole thing. At the end of 1 week, they gave us $2,000, okay, which is a nice sized paycheck. A lot of us went for the paycheck. But what we're supposed to be talking about is juvenile crime and violence. And I spent the first 3 days of that seminar talking about crime, gang violence, and so on, without ever once mentioning that we're talking about men's lives. Not one time. So I brought it up. I raised my hand, and there was only 2 of us who were sociologists, and there were a lot of people from criminology and so on, but not too many sociologists in the room. And I brought it up. I sat there and said, you know, we keep talking about, you know, this type of crime, but these are men who are committing these crimes. Shouldn't we be talking about issues of masculinity and how when we sit there, we push men into this kind of hyper-masculine, violent form of masculinity, it leads them into types of violent crime. And the professor acknowledged it and sat there and said, you know what, that's a fantastic point, and then never went back to it for the next 4 days. Right? And this is one of the issues that in sociology, feminism has forced us to look at those issues. We cannot sit there and think about crime without looking at masculinity in feminist research in sociology. Also, along came this issue of what they call multiracial feminism, you know, because it wasn't enough to just think about feminist research, but women like Maxine Bacazan and Bonnie Thornton-Dill came up with this issue of multiracial feminism because they sat there and they said, wait a minute, we can't sit there and say that all women experience sexism in the same way, all right? Whether you're white, whether you're black, whether you're Latino, whether you have citizenship status, you're going to experience sexism far differently. And some of these women, including some women in what was called the Combahee River Collective, wrote a letter about this because they talked about their marginality in African-American studies programs. By the way, they were a group of self-described black feminist lesbians. And they sat there and talked about their marginality in African-American studies programs, being that those programs were very similar to U.S. history programs, where they sat there and talked about men's lives and the importance of men's lives and men's contributions while ignoring women's contributions. But then they also talked about that in women's feminist programs in the 1970s, they were heavily centered around a white women's movement, okay, with this whole idea that all women in the world have the same oppressor and it's men, and we should be fighting against that oppressor. Well, some of these women sat there and said, slow down, wait a minute. Some of us have been your cooks and nannies, and some of us have been abused by you as well. So we can't sit there and say that there's only one oppressor here, that sometimes we get oppressed on different levels. From that also comes the work of Patricia Hill Collins, where she talks about black feminist thought, okay? And she talks about that black women in particular, she's talking about black women in this issue, but she says, no, you don't have to be a black woman to practice black feminist thought. But she sits there and says that black women are oppressed on 2 different levels, being a woman and also, you know, being African American. She said because of that, it gives them a unique standpoint, a different way of looking at the world. Right? And then she sits there and says that unique standpoint allows them to do research differently, and probably in a more nuanced way than a lot of the male colleagues and a lot of the white colleagues are doing. Now, once again, she doesn't say that you have to be just African American. Some criticisms of Collins' work came out saying, well, what if you're a black woman and a lesbian? Wouldn't you then even have a more unique standpoint? And Collins' response is yes. You know, absolutely yes. You would have a more unique standpoint. But she was speaking specifically about black women's work. So in her research, it says you don't have to be a black woman to sit there and practice this type of research, but you need to take an intersectional approach, which means that you're very conscious of talking about race, class, and gender. Now you can add other identities in there because it doesn't stop. You know, sexuality, able-bodyism, citizenship, all those type of things can be added in there. But she's saying at least race, class, and gender. So intersectional work generally looks at least race, class, and gender. Okay, and you have to consider that. Because she says it's far different being a white male and then being a white female. It's far different being a white male from the upper class and being a white male and poor, right? And those things are going to affect your lives differently. You might have more advantages as being a black woman from the upper class, like Oprah Winfrey has far more advantages than a white working class male does, all right, at that point. Is she still oppressed sometimes? Yes. You know, absolutely she is oppressed sometimes, but she's going to experience it differently. So with this idea that anyone can practice black feminist thought, okay, that men can practice black feminist thought, okay, they just have to be conscious of their positionality and so on and everything else. You know, I went to one of my colleagues, a professor over at USC who's African American, and I asked him, I go, hey, if Collins says anybody can do this, how come more black men haven't done that? And his response to it is, oh, that's easy. We've got enough to worry about with just race. Now, some people might not think about what does that actually mean. But right away, it popped into my head, wait a minute, don't you think black women worry about race? But they worry about gender too. Why is this black men? You can't sit there and think about race and gender at the same time, the same way black women do. So in my research, I sit there and say that there's a reason why. And one, for women, you know, and particularly for women of color who are oppressed on these multiple levels, there's an intimate need to think about race and gender, okay? So for instance, women still do the majority of housework in the United States, right? So women still do the majority of that type of work, which gives them, as Arlie Hochschild calls it, a second shift of work at home that men don't have to do, okay? Women are still expected to do most of the child care duties, which doesn't, allow them space to sit there and pursue their careers in the same way that men do. Right? And women are still, by far, the victims of sexualized violence in this country at a rate that far exceeds that of men. Because I will have some people point out that men do get raped too. Yes, most often by other men, though, okay? And they say that men do get abused too. There's domestic violence that happens towards men. Absolutely, that does happen, but once again, not at the extent that it does happen to women. I am not trying to minimize the idea that men also receive that type of abuse, but when I hear that come out, I find that to be an excuse for the abuse of women, instead of sitting there and trying to explain that, oh yeah, we should think about these guys too. Because when you're looking at the number of women who die at the hands of men due to violence, this type of domestic violence, the number of women who visit emergency rooms, it far dwarfs the number of men who die from the same type of violence. So women have this intimate need to sit there and work on these things and look at these things because they're troubling in their personal life in that moment. While for men, race, and particularly men of color, race becomes an intimate need we need to look at. But gender becomes an outlying need. It's something we can talk about later, after we fix it. It fix everything else about racism. You see this come up in the Black Panther Party, where the Black Panther Party at one point, there comes this discussion. Here you have these strong black women, Angela Davis, Michelle Wallace, Elaine Brown, who were all strong members of the Black Panther Party, amongst others, who were working literally side by side with these African American men fighting in the struggle, in the same exact way they were, putting their lives on the line, going to prison and so on. And then it comes two of these black men in particular, Elridge Cleaver and Stokely Carmichael, who start making statements about women's places in the movements. And what they sit there, Stokely Carmichael makes some comment about the only place for a woman in the movement is prone, on her back in a sexual position, basically, is what he's saying, okay? Elridge Cleaver makes a statement that's even more egregious at some point. It says, I've been raping black women to practice for raping white women. Now, Francis Beale, who led a revolutionary movement that left the Black Panther Party because of Elridge Cleaver's statement,